Hello there, and welcome to the 204th edition of DF Direct Weekly. It's our show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. And man, sometimes a week seems to pass with nothing happening, and then everything happens just before we record. So it is this week. Joining me on the panel, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Yes, hi Rich. I'm reporting in from a new location. But as always, excited to chat the topics of the week. And like you said, there are some big ones this week, so it should be fun.
Yes, some meaty discussion points for sure. And Alex Battaglia, hello.
Yeah, I'm recording from the same old location. Nothing new. But big AMD week. AMD strikes back.
Absolutely.
It's great.
On multiple fronts. And it's all good stuff. So with that, I guess we should just crack on. Okay, so our key news story of the week, and this one is quite fascinating. Obviously, RDNA 4 GPUs released this week. We also had the official unveiling of FSR4 upscaling, which Alex did a video on, and even from preliminary testing, this is looking really, really impressive. Now, interesting thing happened the day before we filmed this, which is to say that AMD strongly hinted that Sony was involved in the creation of FSR4. And we've actually had the chance to get some comments from Mark Cerny on this. He's answered some questions that we put forward there. And the results are highly enlightening. And I guess the key point is that the headline statement, so to speak, is that Sony is looking to integrate some kind of iteration of FSR4 into 2026 PlayStation 5 Pro titles. But there's a lot more to it than that. Oliver, we want to take up the story?
Yeah. So this is really encouraging, I think. Basically, in our comments and our Q&A with Mark Cerny here, he's suggesting that indeed for 2026 titles, they're going to implement basically the neural network from FSR4 into a version of PSSR for the PS5 Pro here for 2026 titles. And I think this is really encouraging, ultimately, beyond any technical aspect of it, because like we've seen from the first few months of PS5 Pro titles, PSSR is a very imperfect solution for AI upscaling relative to solutions from competitors. It is competitive in some respect with FSR2 in a lot of titles, and it can be a fair deal better in some scenarios, but it's not doing a good job of delivering a consistently clear, smooth, stable image in motion and in stills. We've seen some improvements from launch with new versions of PSSR, but they haven't really improved on, I would say, the fundamental areas of weakness with PSSR. They've more improved on SSR resolve, or the foliage is touched up a bit, some of the more egregious areas of the technique, but they haven't really brought it up to parity with those other techniques or anywhere close to that level, really. But FSR4, on the other hand, was super impressive. I mean, I saw this in person with Alex at CES. We spent about 20 minutes poking around in Ratchet & Clank. Alex is obviously an expert at finding the various issues in that title, and obviously Alex's coverage since then has shown that the technique is super impressive. And I was kind of worried here that the PS5 Pro might not have the performance to pull off FSR4, because the machine learning performance of RDNA 4 seems greater than the PS5 Pro here. But it sounds like a version should be achievable in the hardware. At least that's what they're aiming for. Their language is a little bit tentative here, I would say, but that's certainly their aim here. So I think ultimately, with PS5 Pro here, a lot of our concerns, I feel like, were localized that initial batch of PS5 Pro titles. And I think we made a point of saying this, which is that the hardware is quite compelling, but the technique they were using for machine learning upscaling in that hardware was not quite up to snuff compared to competitor solutions. And what we've seen from that hardware in terms of the ray tracing acceleration, which we know is quite similar to the ray tracing acceleration that's present in RDNA 4, was actually pretty decent. We are seeing ray tracing, enhanced ray tracing in a number of titles, including the recent Monster Hunter Wilds and Assassin's Creed Shadows. Both those titles have RT reflections on PS5 Pro, whereas the base consoles don't have RT reflections. So yeah, I'm really encouraged to see that. I think it sets Sony up really well for PS6 potentially, getting these technologies in place for their next generation console early, effectively. And yeah, I'm really, really encouraged to see this. I'm really, really glad to see this. I was wondering if maybe FSR4 in some capacity would be able to run in PS5 Pro here. It seems like that is indeed the case, and it should mean really good things, hopefully, for image quality in PS5 Pro software.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, Alex, there are differences in terms of the machine learning implementation, which is custom on Sony and obviously AMD specific on AMD. Do you have any sort of comments on that? On this concept of moving the model across from FSR4 to PlayStation there?
Yeah, there's we have some great confirmation of some things that I speculated on, and I'm willing to say, yeah, I was wrong about that. Mark Cerny makes mention that the PlayStation 5 Pro's 300 tops figure for its integer 8 kind of theoretical top speed there is actually in reference to it without sparsity. Doesn't make mention of it actually supporting sparsity on the PlayStation 5 Pro. And sparsity basically was a way, at least Nvidia, back in the day when I think it was when Ampere came out, that they revised the DLSS 2 model at the time and they improved the speed specifically on Ampere and above. And that's kind of what got into like the sub 1 millisecond range, at least for that DLSS CNN model. So we have confirmation there that PS5 Pro does have 300 tops of int 8, which would put it behind, without sparsity, which would put it a little bit behind RDNA 4 for those calculations. Based on some AMD patents that are circulating, it appears that we may be seeing some sort of like hybridized model here, targeting RDNA 4 for FSR4 that may be somewhere in between and utilizing features of both a CNN and a transformer model, but it specifically may be accelerated by FP8 instructions, which is something that wasn't commented at all on in any of the PS5 Pro disclosures, but it is something that is new, for example, to RDNA 4. So the whole tentative wording here that Oliver talked about, and the fact that it's like 2026 tells me, like, or at least my conjecture would be that the timelines once again are not like completely lined up. Right. Sony had to shoot first and they had to target different hardware at first. Like the size of the CU would be a lot bigger if it was more like the CUs we'd see in an RDNA 4 GPU that supported maybe more instructions. So maybe as conjecture here, Sony doesn't support the specific acceleration which currently FSR4 is using on RDNA 4 on PC. So there's going to be maybe an elongated porting process to get it up to snuff in terms of quality and performance, because that's another thing that Cerny mentions in this interview is that they want to have it being used in titles that are targeting 60 FPS. If it exceeds a certain millisecond threshold, 60 FPS becomes a lot less viable, right? So I'm very curious to see what the end product looks like. If it does look like FSR4 in all of its aspects, to say the least, FSR4 for me was amazing looking in person, seeing it running. I only was able to try it in the Nixies games essentially, because that's where FSR 3.1 support was just perfect. I had trouble with other titles actually, but there it worked really, really well. And the quality was incredible, really stable, more stable than DLSS 4 in some areas that I pointed out in the video. And with less artifacting too. I also showed off DLSS 4 transformer model can show striations in images that I kind of also pointed out in the ray reconstruction video I did. So it's like very stable and really good at anti-aliasing, which I really like to see, because I actually prefer images that are even a bit softer with better anti-aliasing than those that are like a lot sharper but have trouble with anti-aliasing. So I actually really like FSR4's resolve quite a bit. And I would like to see if PSSR could get to that kind of level of stability and quality that I saw there. But I guess we're gonna have to wait like a year or so to see what that might look like.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, Oliver, you were asking Mark what the short and long term goals are with Amethyst, and we got some quite interesting information there.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like in the short term, their goal is basically to develop mostly neural network architectures here for game graphics. And that certainly was an area of some conversation when I spoke to Mark back in October of last year. And then in the long term, their goal is basically to work on hardware designs, which makes sense given that Amethyst, I believe, started about a year ago, that collaboration, they said. And looking
Right.
forward, that would certainly presumably be involved to some degree in the creation of, let's say, a next generation PlayStation console, and presumably would not factor as much into the hardware design, if at all, I would assume, of the PS5 Pro. That was probably locked down before most of this Amethyst collaboration started. So I would hope that in the short term, we're going to see something like Alex said, some kind of variation on FSR4 for the PlayStation 5 Pro console, and then presumably for the PlayStation 6 as well down the line, and then some additional level of hardware collaboration to hopefully improve the state of future Sony hardware here. And I think certainly at least this as a first output potentially from this Amethyst collaboration between Sony and AMD here, seeing FSR4 on PC certainly indicates that perhaps this will be a fruitful partnership, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Interesting disclosure there that they're looking for a more ideal hardware architecture for machine learning. So, obviously a collaboration with the intent of producing something that applies to all markets there. Something which also caught my eye was a hint, I guess. I mean, we were basically asking if the denoising demo that you guys saw, and I guess it was in is it the Toy Shop
Yes.
demo? Was that a part of Amethyst? Mark Cerny says, all I can say is stay tuned. There's a lot of opportunity with our Amethyst collaboration. We know that ray tracing is a huge part of the graphics future. So from my perspective, it's quite interesting that, let's be clear here. Nvidia has laid down basically almost like the roadmap for ray tracing and AI features. And they've kind of paid off. I mean, ray reconstruction is pretty excellent. The whole ray tracing suite they've come up with, the integration with ML, it's all sort of paying off. And then we've got Amethyst, which is essentially producing very similar technologies. Is there any sort of final words on this, Alex? Because it's quite intriguing to see this come out.
Yeah, I mean, just in general, we know the cost of running all these ML things on the GPU is still expensive, even with proper acceleration. We saw, RDNA4 RX 9070 XT had I would say, measurable performance cost to running it. Then you go over on the Nvidia side, and in a game that has kind of like lackluster, I would describe it, quality of denoising, if you turn on ray reconstruction there, you'll often find that ray reconstruction, and definitely the transformer model, is a lot more expensive than normal denoising. So you're getting a much higher quality, but it's also more expensive. And that's one thing that I'm very curious to see, based upon this set of questions and answers from Mark Cerny here, how much of that is like realistically portable to games on the console, because there's just many more constraints there for performance that where on a PC you can say like, I'll be with VRR, G-Sync, MFG, whatever, you just like throw all these other things on top to try and make it worthwhile, right? Whereas on console it's like, no, we got to hit like a 60 V-Sync, right? So it's a different environment. So I'm very curious to see what that means to that. But for the more long-term future, I'm extremely happy now that FSR4 in some form is going to be coming to PSSR, even if it ends up like not being all the way there for the first implementation. We at least know that PS6 will definitely have the hardware based upon what we see in RDNA 4 to run it in full, big form, whatever. So good times ahead.
Well, you would assume that PS6 would be using some custom variant of UDNA, which is the next generation architecture. So, exciting times ahead. We know almost nothing about it, really. But I'm sure it's going to be really interesting to see how it all plays out. But with that, let's move on. Staying with AMD, this week, of course, we saw the release of RDNA 4, the 9070 XT and the 9070. My review's out. I was actually really heartened to see that we got our FSR and FSR4 video out actually before my review, which was... I think everybody really wanted to know what Alex thought of it. Because we had that tease at CES where it was like, hey, this is looking really, really impressive. But would it stand up to the direct feed capture scrutiny? And the answer is yes, it does. Actually, Alex, that's an interesting point, because obviously a lot of the time when you do your deep dives into image reconstruction techniques, people are kind of criticizing you for this sort of zoom in approach and not being able to actually see the differences in real life, when at CES you actually were looking at it in a real life scenario.
Yeah, and it's not like I was doing it in post or something. It was just obvious to like the most casual observer. And I think a lot of people, like the top rated comment on the video is like, gosh, like something like FSR4 destroys FSR3 or something like that. I think that's like the top rated comment, something along those lines. And it's enough that just like an average audience person can upvote something that says something that is so obvious to their eyes, right? And I think that is what the FSR4 demos we've seen so far in the games where you can inject it in. Because I didn't actually try it on any game where there was a native option in the menu. The way it's done is you go into what I was about to call it Catalyst Control Center. That's old. I'm old. You go into the AMD driver options, and there under the gaming section, you can turn off a variety of things, including MF2 and things like that. And there's an FSR4 option there. And then when you get into game, you have to do it before you get into game. And then it says like active in game in the top right corner of the screen. It's not exactly super intuitive, but it's not too far away from what Nvidia is doing with their injection.
Okay, so let's focus on the 9070 and the 9070 XT. The reviews out there have been quite illuminating in that so many people are getting so many different results with these cards. And it kind of highlights to me, although we do it now because we've got the technology to do it very, very easily, the concept of aggregated benchmark results. It all seems to be varying quite dramatically based on what you're actually testing. And I guess that's what happens when you introduce an entirely different architecture. But I'm curious what you think of these two cards, Alex, because we'll talk about the whole market situation and MSRPs and cost. But fundamentally, these cards are cheaper and more numerous than Nvidia, although some people beg to differ. It's just the market's just a total mess at the moment. But I'm curious about your thoughts about the actual hardware specifically. Well, let's be fair here. We've given AMD a tough time over the years for two things. FSR not being particularly great. They've made big strides there. It's excellent. RT performance, though, that's always where they've kind of been like almost a generation behind Nvidia. But this time, it seems pretty good.
Yeah, I would say that is one of the key differences this time around that impresses me. We already talked about FSR4. I don't need to say too much more about that. But looking at a lot of your benchmarks. So in the past with RDNA 3, there were benchmarks like Metro, and I would also say things like Avatar. Games that they really pushed RT hard, but with the consoles in mind. Like they really made sure that they were taking like the proper shortcuts that didn't too much so influence like image quality. Like I'll always go back to Far Cry 6 where I thought like they took too many shortcuts with the RT, or something like Resident Evil. All of those games that used Capcom's ray tracing there, where a lot of the shortcuts were visible. But with a game like Metro, as well as with Avatar, a lot of the shortcuts are less visible constantly, and they really, like they're using like DirectX version 1.1, which is kind of the thing that came around when RDNA 2 came around to more fit that hardware's paradigm. And they scale and look really, really great. And this time around, RDNA 4 and those titles, like Star Wars Outlaws, Metro, F1 2024, you saw some really incredible results that were really putting the fight to Nvidia. And these are games where it's not like there's a lack of RT. That's why it's more similar. It's more like well implemented, really well optimized RT. And that's where they seem to fare best. In games where like DX 1.0, DXR 1.0 is in use, and/or I would say like some of the shading is a bit more complex. Like there's possibly less simplifications to shading and how many triangles are being traced. That's where you start to see still, even with RDNA 4, there is still some stratification there between NVIDIA and AMD. And I think that bared out really well across the benchmarks you did, Rich, as well as things I saw from Hardware Unboxed, as well as from Gamers Nexus, where you could also see this larger stratification depending upon the title. But the overall average results, I think, painted a really good picture for AMD, and one that at least, sticking to ray tracing at the moment. Where I would say, most particularly, obviously with the 7900 XTX before, you could get a pretty good ray tracing experience in a lot of games, but now I would see even more so based upon the amount of money you're giving out for the product. Especially if it is 600 MSRP, then that is some pretty solid, great ray tracing performance. They said 4K, 1440p price, 4K performance, but especially if you're at a 1440p display, and especially if you can use FSR4, then you're going to get a really good looking experience in a lot of games. And I think that's what it is. It crosses the threshold finally for me of getting a good visual experience, because I think before, if you were using FSR2, you had to just always pocket some of that change and say oh yeah, okay, so I can turn on ray tracing, but the image quality isn't always great. And now it's I get really great image quality, better than Nvidia in a number of ways, and I can also turn on RT and it looks good. And I think that's a new mountain that has been climbed by AMD here, where it doesn't look like you're giving up all these things to have a cheaper card, right? And that's really important.
It was to the point with FSR2 and FSR3 that you were hoping that there was an XeSS implementation in there as well, because the software XeSS was just better than both of them. And, it's there was always a sort of bizarre irony to the fact that actually, older AMD cards do have a machine learning upscaler. The fact is, though, it's made by Intel. Which isn't ideal, really, but, it is what it is. I'm curious what you think about these cards, Oliver.
I think it's fantastic, like Alex said, that we finally have a kind of mostly compromise-free set of GPUs from AMD, in particular GPUs that are really competitive in terms of price and performance, and that have obviously FSR4, which we've discussed before, and it's just a tremendous upscaler. I think relative even to expectations, even after seeing that demo, I did not expect it to be as refined as it ended up being in Alex's video there. But for the PC market at the moment, I'm not totally sure what it means, because a lot depends on the actual price that you pay at the retailer. There are a lot of 9070 series cards available, but it does seem like MSRPs are still a bit up and down, like Alex is gesturing here, because it does seem like, basically from what I've seen at least, that maybe retailers were stocking up on cards but paying a price that is similar to MSRP or even a little bit above the final MSRP of the cards, and then AMD is maybe providing some kind of rebate program or something like that to retailers to clear that inventory of cards, or at least some amount of the inventory of cards at MSRP, at the new MSRP, which apparently was a little bit lower than perhaps they were initially planning. And now that initial allocation is sold out in some cases, and the prices are going up. And then, of course, in the United States, you have these crazy tariffs and all that stuff. So that's all playing into this potentially, and making the price situation a little bit less reliable than those MSRP numbers are indicating. Like, I think the typical price now for a 5070 Ti is something like $900. Typical price for a 9070 class card might be $100 or so above MSRP at the moment. So that situation needs to settle into something predictable, at least before you can make any really confident recommendations. But I'm super happy for what it means for PC. I'm super happy for what it means for consoles, especially if, like, Microsoft announces next generation Xbox perhaps for next year or some nearby period, right? Because that will probably be RDNA 4 based, I would have to assume, based on the timing there. And this seems like a really good console architecture. You have the RT performance that we saw from PS5 Pro, basically a similar set of accelerations there that produces much better ray tracing performance, at least in titles that use more limited ray tracing in particular. That certainly is a very positive sign. FSR4, fantastic, obviously. I can not stop saying how good it is. I watched Alex's video multiple times just to peek at the analysis that he had there, and I really, really enjoyed that. So yeah, I think it's great for that. I think it's also potentially great for handhelds. I'm excited for that at some point in the future, perhaps some point in the distant future. But, if FSR4 can scale to low resolutions, low power handhelds, that's really exciting too. So I think it's just a great architecture. It's like an architecture that I'd be really comfortable with my own personal gaming PC. I think it's doing some really, really nice things in games. FSR4 rocks. I'm just super happy with the launch across the board in a way that I didn't expect to be, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Well, first of all, I'm going to quickly just complain again about the whole concept of buying a GPU, which seems to be a completely alien experience to buying just about any other piece of consumer technology. It's like, the whole situation has just got completely out of hand to the point where, why are we considering paying an extra $200 for a better cooling solution? The concept is just completely nuts. It does not make sense. It does not sort of bear any sort of comparison to any other piece of technology out there. I think there's obviously a market for people that want to have, a different looking piece of equipment in their PC for whatever reason. It might be, they want to have RGB lights. It might be that they want to have like triple fans, all of this sort of stuff. But fundamentally, the core product that should be available at MSRP should be pretty decent, right? Which is kind of summed up by the Founders Edition cards that Nvidia puts out. I think that we need to move to a model where the vendors take control, where cards are actually sold at the prices they say they're going to be sold for. And then maybe, a couple of weeks down the line, the partner models come in. And, that's the point where people can maybe sort of start to consider, right, okay, I do want all of these entirely unnecessary, for the most part, additions to the GPU, and I don't mind paying a premium for it. It's just bizarre. I'll say it again. Where is the Asus Mac Mini with, that isn't mini anymore because it's got a gigantic cooler on it? It just doesn't exist. It's just utterly bizarre that, where is the Asus 9800X3D that's, it doesn't exist. Where is the MSI DDR5 with, gigantic coolers on that aren't really needed? It's just utterly bizarre. And you're paying like hundreds of dollars for the privilege. It's just really, really weird. Something's just completely broken there. In terms of the cards themselves, I think they're going to do great because, a lot of the two key issues that we had with AMD, specifically the upscaling and the ray tracing, they are now much more competitive, if not better. The concept of having a card that's notionally the same price between AMD and Nvidia, and AMD is producing better ray tracing performance. This should be lighting up sort of red alert alarms over Nvidia. This is not really acceptable. This is their heartland that AMD has sort of struck into here. And it's potentially great for competition. Now, the thing is, though, obviously there is still work to do, right? Because Nvidia has this gigantic mind share in the graphics market to the point where it is the default purchase. Now there is also the concept of the fear of missing out, the FOMO, because it's still the case that Nvidia cards do more than AMD cards. The concept of AAA path tracing games, I thought was basically impossible until we saw that Cyberpunk RT Overdrive thing. And yet there it is. And now we're seeing more of these games. And it's quite remarkable to see. Ray reconstruction, obviously one of the key issues with you've kind of got to have a great upscaler package to make ray tracing palpably work from a performance perspective. But ray reconstruction basically solves the issue that if you upscale ray tracing from a lower resolution, you still get lower resolution ray tracing effects in your upscaled image. Ray reconstruction solves that. You can kind of see from the Toy Shop demo that AMD is pursuing the same lines of investigation, but the quality results weren't so good. So, you've got this situation now where AMD is catching up. They're making key additions to the architecture to improve things, to make themselves more competitive. I'd say that on the software side, at least, NVIDIA isn't being complacent. They're still adding all of those features. You're still able to get experiences on an NVIDIA card you can't on an AMD. I'll say on the software side, because the Blackwell situation in terms of the products culminating in the 5070, which is a misfire, there does, this is beginning to look a bit like complacency. I don't know what you think, Alex.
Yeah, I'd say at least in terms of the product stack arrangement, reveals a level of complacency. Software, not at all. They're incredibly aggressive, where that was the most overwhelming part of the CES presentations was just the amount of software advancement, which Oliver and I saw in so many demos. So I wouldn't ever say it there, but in terms of the hardware side, it's like that, especially right when you get below the 5090, which is the rest of the stack, like everything just starts become like having all these compromises, whether it's in terms of price, whether it's in terms of like what's going on under the hood. I don't want to even talk about the missing ROPs and the exploding power cables and whatnot. Like this is just
screens.
Disastrous stuff. But obviously not at all my experience with the RX 9070 XT so far. And there's one thing to talk about though, is like you also talked about it to me behind the scenes, Rich. You measured in your review power differentials between RX 9070 XT and 5070 Ti, right? And
they can be pretty huge.
Yeah, they can be pretty large. And, the size of the chip, right, Rich, that's also another thing to consider here. It's a little bit like when ARC launched in that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, you've got the Navi 48 processor is kind of like a similar size to the RTX 5080. And yet they're having to use that same chip to compete against the 5070, which is on another, Nvidia's got a completely separate, much smaller chip for that. So, there is efficiency stuff to talk about here, both in terms of power on the XT, which I honestly think they seem to have pushed it really, really hard to make it as competitive with the 5070 Ti as possible. And it doesn't feel like that's where it should be when you look at the 9070, where efficiency is so much, much, much better. And then there's also the concept of die sizes where, NVIDIA is able to produce. I mean, the 9070, we thought it would be tons better than the 5070, and it is better, but it's not always, it's not like a class apart, so to speak. And yet, you've got this GPU that's going to be much, much cheaper for NVIDIA to make. So, there's still, I think, engineering differentials there between AMD and NVIDIA. Yeah. I mean, we've got a couple of supporter questions. We'll tackle those quickly. This one from MG Subby. If the 9070 XT ends up being a massive success, what do you think the odds are of AMD releasing a 9080 XT? 9070 XT looks very appealing next to NVIDIA's lineup, but it's just not enough of an upgrade over my 3080 for me. An $800 9080 XT with, say, 84 CUs and 20 gigs of RAM would be a great fit for me, however. This is the interesting thing, right? Because, going back to the chip size, we've got a 5080 sized broadly equivalent chip. So, basically to make, a 9080 XT, they would have to really make an even bigger chip than that. And that kind of pushes you towards sort of 4090, 5090 style sort of product, which would be extremely expensive to make, I suspect. Right. And they've basically said, AMD has said they're not going to be competing at the high end, and they're striking at the mainstream. And certainly in terms of notional price versus performance, they've done a great job. This one from Mr. Pyrotech. Hello, gents. Since new GPUs from AMD are out and reviews dropped just as the embargo lifted, we can all see how they perform in games. However, there were several titles where the performance was not in the quote-unquote expected range, specifically in RT tests. Do you think this will be fixed in upcoming driver updates or maybe in the games themselves? The expected range was kind of where things landed for me, but I think one of the great things about the PC press is that people are really good at benchmarking now and benchmarking different things. And so, you can never really watch one GPU review to get an outlook on whether you should buy it or not, because you've got a diversity of data out there. So I thought it did fit in expected range, but,
curious
other people
about what those titles are. One thing you also have to remember is not every title is made the same and doing the exact same thing with RT. Mm-hmm. So like I described earlier, like Avatar, Outlaws, Metro, good looking RT, but they make like optimizations there that are more benefiting towards RDNA 2, which then helps the AMD a lot, for example, right? Other titles, specifically ones that have been sponsored by Nvidia or Intel would not necessarily be doing that at all, because that is not at all what they're targeting. So there could be different scaling there just in general. So I'm curious to what this person's referencing though. But your review also showed it really well, Rich, when you're doing the Dying Light run, that like the beginning part of the run and the end part of the run have different differentials. The average comes out, of course, but like if you looked at 1 second versus another second, you might get a different appreciation. So
yeah, that's kind of bizarre, but for sure, yeah. Going back to the sort of Nvidia versus AMD thing, Alex, I mean, we had a supporter question last week, which we didn't talk about, but I did send it to you, and I thought it was quite an interesting conceit, which is that, instead of doing GPU reviews based on apples to apples benchmarks, you would basically just take something like the 5070 against the 9070 and just play games and changing the settings according to what best fits that GPU. And obviously it'd be DLSS on one, it would be, FSR on the other, or maybe XESS depending on the game.
Right.
And you would be using possibly frame generation 4x or 3x on Nvidia, and you wouldn't be using frame generation at all because it may not be supported on AMD, that sort of thing. What you would actually end up with there is what I've kind of called an anti-benchmark review, where you're deliberately completely ignoring the concept of apples to apples testing because it's not really relevant to the consumer experience. You would be looking at 10, I guess from our perspective, it would be AAA games.
Right.
And you would be just tailoring those games to the strengths of your particular PC and the GPU that you've got, and then you would test them side by side, which I suspect is probably something that we should possibly think about doing. I don't know what you think about that.
I think it's an amazing idea too, because it would then show off the differences in software packaging, as well as input latency would become more relevant. You wouldn't be stuck in this, we use TAA at native land that is just completely made up. That's a very low percentage of people that are doing that. I loved the comments under my video. They're like, Alex is saying FSR2, FSR3 was never usable, but I have always only used native. And it's like, good for you. Really good for you. I also loved some of the comments that were like, DF complains that, people complain that DLSS only works on a certain subset of hardware, but here AMD does it and they're praising it. It's like, well, it kind of takes some sort of hardware advancement to make this software even viable. So like, once again, these complaints I just don't understand. But getting back to the question at hand, the anti-benchmark would be an amazing concept for a video, because you'd be finally showing people the way they actually would potentially use these GPUs in the wild. Then you would be doing stuff like, should I turn on AFMF2 in the driver then to get a better experience in this game? Is it making a better experience? Right? Like, then you'd actually come to this question, like, is it doing it? Is it doing its job?
It would be turning PC GPU reviews into more of a console style comparison almost. Because you would be, developers use the strengths of each individual console to produce the best experience there. I'm curious what you think of this concept, Oliver.
Well, I think it's an interesting concept. That's certainly the way that I think I would personally go about comparing the GPUs if I was to produce such a video. I think that's certainly the way that I would see it. But I also think a lot depends on your own personal preferences in terms of image fluidity, your own monitor setup. Like if you're targeting 120 hertz TV, that's a very different kind of setup in terms of frame generation usage, in terms of upscaling usage, than trying to do like 240 hertz, 480 hertz, whatever. And then obviously there are so many factors here. Also the resolution you're targeting. I mean, a lot of people are targeting really high refresh 1440p monitors. There are just so many factors, but I do think like for a given display, for a given target in terms of user preference, setting up the two machines to basically facilitate that experience and getting hopefully a good experience on both platforms and showing what the differences there are. I think that's certainly a really compelling concept. And I think there, probably the two biggest points of differentiation would be the presence of really high quality MFG on the Nvidia side, whereas with AMD, you have to use like lossless scaling or something. And then obviously ray reconstruction is another big factor. AMD has a technology in the works there, but it's not really up to snuff at the moment, at least from what we've seen so far in various demos. It's not quite there, probably not even that close to being there necessarily. So those would be the 2 points.
it's all on a title by title basis, isn't it? Because there is FSR3 frame generation, of course.
Of course.
But there are DLSS,
but not MFG.
But frame generation in general is kind of dominated by Nvidia. Again, it goes back to this whole sort of proliferation of features. Reflex is, because it's a part of DLSS 3 frame generation, you've got basically an anti-lag solution that's built into a huge range of games. And AMD's only really just put out anti-lag 2. So it's far behind in that respect as well. Yeah, interesting stuff. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on. Well, I say we're going to move on. We're actually still going to be talking about AMD. But Alex, something that came up in the review period was, how can I say it? RDNA 4 obviously has big advantages versus RDNA 3 in, like for like, CU for CU for ray tracing, right? However, when it comes to path tracing, there were some unexpectedly poor results. Now, I did actually look into this, and it was going to be a segment in the review, but the results were so poor for the most part that I decided they needed verification and double checking before I went live with it. But it does look as though, everybody else is seeing the same things here. So we've got an interesting case here with Cyberpunk 2077 where we've got, in fact, all of these tests are going to be native 1080p path tracing. We've turned off its native resolution rendering. We've turned off all sort of vendor-specific technologies that we can to give a like-for-like sort of testing apples to apples. So this is almost academic in a way because, the concept of native rendering path tracing is kind of nuts. Mm-hmm. But it does show that AMD and RDNA 4 does seem to have specific weaknesses there. I'm just bringing up some statistics here. Yeah, so in Cyberpunk, for example, on path tracing, I've got the RTX 5070 Ti having a 66% advantage over the 9070 XT, which is far in excess of any other gain that Nvidia has across all of the rest of standard ray tracing benchmarks, right? Meanwhile, the situation is somewhat different. The RX 9070 is beaten out at 22% by the RTX 5070, bearing in mind that's actually a relatively poor NVIDIA GPU. Now, that's the path tracing situation, right? You'll also note in the imagery here that there seems to be some really odd frame pacing issues with both of the NVIDIA cards there. So if we switch over to Psycho RT benchmarks with the RTX and the RX cards there, well, it turns out that the RTX 5070 Ti is only like 18.7% faster, which is, very, very different, right? And the RTX 5070 just 5.7% faster. So Alex, what's going on here? How can we explain this? How can a path tracing result be so very, very different to a ray tracing result?
Well, a ray tracing result, at least the ones you're describing right there in Cyberpunk, at least, they're just going to be doing a specific effect against a simplified version of the shading model for each one, versus the path tracing result where they will send out a ray to get an idea of what the indirect lighting is at the spot, and then send out another one from that location to get a second ordinate bounce from there to inform the shading again. And I pretty much would presume that extra level of work from there is not at all within the paradigm of more simplified ray tracing that AMD has put out ever since RDNA 2 came out. The like I described before, the DXR 1.1 model wasn't necessarily designed around doing like full path tracing at all, versus DXR 1.0, which was. So that's probably one of the key differences, just the more randomness, more rays, more spawning from a similar location, more bounces, all that stuff, where maybe some of this falls on its face. Another thing is also that RTX 5070 Ti in that game, in Cyberpunk specifically, will have the benefits, a couple of other benefits that are turned on as soon as path tracing's turned on. You'll have the benefit of it using shader execution reordering, which will make the GPU have a lot better utilization. Mm-hmm. And another thing, it will have also access to opacity micromaps, which will make anything that is like semi-transparent cheaper to render. Whereas AMD cards there won't have the benefit of that, and that'll actually pretty negatively affect their performance. OMMs in a scene that has a lot of transparency should be really effective. So that's another thing that when we talk about path tracing, there is like going to be a like for like scenario as much as you can try and create. But Nvidia is so pervasive in these titles that they're trying to push things that go beyond DXR spec, because DXR spec is not enough, right? It just isn't. That's why DLSS ray reconstruction exists, because it goes completely out of the DX spec. And that's hopefully, I'm very curious to see what AMD does here in the future, because FSR4 right now, first of all, it's only covering super resolution. But I'm curious to see if they push actually for all of their work that they're going to do with machine learning to be also compatible with Microsoft's cooperative vectors API, which will allow for machine learning across a broad range of hardware, not just those from one of the vendors. Right. Intel could run it. So I'm curious to see if there's like porting of FSR4 to that in the future, as well as any of their machine learning denoising stuff. Because then that could become the de facto way you like load up a game. It'll have those things on first, and then maybe NVIDIA is something that's there or not there at all. But these results though are intense. It still goes to show that RDNA 4 better in some areas, but still isn't up there when it comes to path tracing.
I also looked at Alan Wake 2, which obviously, again, can't really be compared like to like because of the RTX mega geometry that the NVIDIA cards be using. But even so, I found that the 5070 had a 15% advantage over the 9070, and looking at the TI versus XT, 45% faster, which, again, you'd kind of expect that, I guess, bearing in mind that all of these titles would have been developed on NVIDIA hardware, basically, and certainly in close collaboration with NVIDIA. But it's certainly quite telling that AMD isn't sort of anywhere near parity in that regard. So we were looking, Alex, for a title that may not be tapping into stuff like shader execution, reordering, stuff like that. We settled upon Black Myth Wukong, thinking, well, okay, I mean, we don't know for sure what's happening under the hood, really, do we? But there didn't seem to be any evidence of some extensive collaboration there. But the results are even wider here, to an extent that I couldn't quite get my head around. The 5070 having an 87% advantage over the 9070. And, basically, the 5070 Ti is over twice as fast as the 9070 XT. So, the title we were kind of earmarking as perhaps our best apples to apples turned out to be by far the worst.
Yes, well, that happens. I would say in this case, I can only theorize. I wouldn't. There could be good technical reasons for it, but this developer in the past, they think this is one of their first titles ever, really. And to be completely honest with you, mainland China is very much so NVIDIA's territory. And just the way they handled the console versions, there's a lot where I would say maybe they didn't optimize this for AMD cards really much at all. So, there's probably some reality in there, but there's also, put a little bit of salt.
Any thoughts about this, Oliver?
No, I mean, it's kind of a hit not having ray reconstruction. It's kind of a hit not having MFG, but then the performance deficit on top of lacking those two technologies, which have proven like pretty important in the NVIDIA side, kind of hurts. I think if they're at like 70 or 80% of the performance of comparable GPUs, otherwise comparable NVIDIA GPUs, that's probably a pretty good effort, considering these are NVIDIA-led, NVIDIA-sponsored titles that have like massively intensive ray tracing demands. Yeah. But if it's like 40%, 50%, as is the case in a title like Black Myth Wukong, that's like obviously not even close to really where you'd want to be in terms of actually achieving an experience that you'd actually want to have in that hardware, right? Instead of just having like the default Lumen experience on that class of hardware there. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but I hope future RDNA designs, I guess UDNA designs will improve on this in quite a bit, or hopefully they can improve it a little bit in some more AMD friendly titles there relative to this crop of games, which is not super inspiring.
So something that's given me a bit of a chuckle, Alex, is during CES there was I think we talked about it in the past. Black Myth Wukong 4K native path tracing was shown running at like 27 FPS on a 5090, and everyone thought it was like a nuclear disaster. And here we're looking at, AMD and Nvidia running at native 1080p, and the 9070 XT is slower than that, which is quite remarkable. And the Nvidia results aren't great either, really. It's even so. So the concept of BMW doing, high 20s at native 4K with path tracing is actually quite miraculous. But even so, that's what we've got to say about that. Let's move on. Okay, so interesting thing that happened this week. I was actually sent a video showing a game running with frame generation active, but it was dynamic frame generation. So basically, you could dial in a specific output frame rate that you wanted, and you could see that the input frame rate was basically changing all the time. This is a really interesting concept, right? The idea being that you basically set the output frame rate to be the refresh rate of your display. And then frame generation is kind of like filling in the gaps. Now, what is the technology doing this? Is it Nvidia? Is it AMD? The answer is no. It's lossless scaling, which is a tool that you've looked at, Alex. Mm-hmm. And obviously, the concept that you can add frame generation to any game is compelling, but there are some caveats with it. But I really wanted to test this out, right? So we've got some footage here. We're going to kick off, I think, with Control. The first thing I did was to go to the Corridor of Doom. Now, the system that I'm using here is the Ryzen 5 3600, the RTX 4060, which is a mirror image of what Alex's mainstream system is these days. Which you deeply dislike the RTX 4060. I think
I don't like that GPU that much. No, pretty much don't at all, almost. But yeah,
which makes this test all the more interesting because it is the Corridor of Doom. It is high ray tracing being used here, and you can see we're sort of sub 30 FPS, but the output frame rate is indeed 120 frames per second. Now, obviously, the bigger the gap there is between internal frame rate and the output 120 there, the more artifacts there are going to be, and you can kind of see that there. But when I switch to medium ray tracing and lower the resolution, so I actually use the DLSS transformer model here, 720p upscaling to 1440p, captured at 120 frames per second, it starts to be pretty good, I think. And you do have a variable frame rate, quite variable, in fact. Mm-hmm. And you do have a locked 120 coming out. I'm curious what you made of this footage, Alex.
Okay, well, I think this is pretty interesting, a little bit bizarre. It aligns a lot, though, with when we originally saw FSR4 as well as what would become AFMF at the AMD booth at Gamescom in 2023, was it, Rich? 2020?
Oh, God.
Yeah, might have been.
Yeah. I think it was.
Yeah. There we talked with Nick Tibiros, and now his left AMD is over at Intel, if I'm not mistaken. And I asked him, like, what do you see as the future of frame generation? And he said at that point in time that you just have a really high refresh rate monitor, and we don't bother with VRR anymore. Yeah. Very interesting concept, by the way. We don't bother with VRR anymore, which is kind of like a headache in a lot of ways that we could get into. And you just allow frame generation to take whatever performance you can get and bring it up to the closest to the end output of your monitor. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. That input, the way lossless scaling shows it, there's like the input on the one side, and then that it shows you the output, and you can see the multiplicative factor. In the past, it would be done in a way where it would always be exactly double or exactly triple, and that's what you'd get as your final performance. But here, it's taking uneven frame rates and somehow getting them divisible to this output 120. You obviously recorded this. And I think that is kind of fascinating. I'm not exactly sure how it is doing it. I would almost want to imagine kind of like the equivalent of fast VSync. Maybe it is throwing out frames that it is not using. And
possibly. So I mean, you'd expect to see problems with panning and camera motion on that, surely.
Yeah, I guess so. But then, I mean, I don't understand it then. I don't actually understand it then off the top of
I
my
have
head.
actually written to the.
This requires more
a
investigation.
study.
Yeah.
It also requires asking the developer how he did it, which is what I've done. I haven't had a response yet, but I'm curious to see it because it's a really interesting concept. It's not without its flaws because latency is an issue. I can definitely feel the difference even with a controller, but the concept is intriguing. I don't know what you thought of it, Oliver.
Yeah, I mean, I think it looks really good in control here. Actually, just scanning through your footage, Rich, I think it looks quite convincing here at 120 FPS, surprisingly so, even though the base frame rate sometimes is dipping reasonably low there. It is looking pretty good. Now, in another title you did test, Starfield, it does look a little bit messier, which perhaps I could talk about in a moment. It also has issues with UI elements, which, like you'd expect, it's not like being properly composited in there, just operating on that final image. Personally, I've played a lot with LSFG, Lossless Scaling Frame Generation, especially in older software, and I actually generally find the quality of the frame gen to be pretty good for a lot of purposes, especially with LSFG 3, which improved a lot over LSFG 2. It's quite good. At high frame rates in particular, it works well, but I really like it with games that are older that have like 60 FPS caps. So I was playing just the other day, I was playing with Lossless Scaling, Sonic Racing Transformed. We talked about that a little bit last week. Perhaps, but that game at 120 FPS or 120 Hertz with Lossless Scaling is a pretty good experience. Another title I've played with that is the new Crew game, the Crew Motorsport, which is locked to 60 FPS on PC, presumably for competitive reasons, which is very annoying, but it does look a lot better with LSFG there. So yeah, but I mean, for most new titles, I would prefer, obviously I prefer DLSS, obviously I prefer FSR, but for older games, I think it's terrific. And here, with that variable upscaling, based off of kind of an arbitrary base frame rate, that's really cool. And yeah, getting the potentially for that to work with VSync in a really convincing way, I'd like to see that in person for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just generally, I mean, in your video on Lossless Scaling, Alex, it was just like, well, this is a really cool piece of software. It's actually rather inexpensive. Just grab it on Steam, and so by that extension, I think it's just kind of worth buying. just generally. I wanted to also, I mean, Control is basically a GPU limited scenario, right? I was using ray tracing and whatnot there. But, just the concept of using a 4060 to get 120 frames per second with a 1440p output, it's really cool. CPU limited scenarios. Now that 3600 folds like a card table when you get to Aquila in Starfield. And I thought I'd just run our CPU benchmark on it, right? Because you get a high-speed run through Aquila. And, you're getting, especially when you're at 4K resolution or when you're hitting the CPU limit there, you just get, some really low frame rates. It goes into the 20s and we're upscaling the output to 120 frames per second, which is just, it's a stupid thing to do. You shouldn't be doing it. But here we are. And you can basically see that the artifacts start to crop in there, particularly at the bottom of the screen and around the HUD element in the bottom right there. Those are the two most noticeable elements from my perspective. But, the automated benchmark that we've got goes through three resolutions, goes through 4K, 1440p, and 1080p. And basically, yeah, the lower the resolution you get, the less of a say the GPU has in it, and the more of a say that the Ryzen has in it. And basically, obviously, it's kind of obvious to say it really, but the lower the resolution you have, the higher the frame rate until you hit that CPU limit. But it's kind of okay, but it is sort of quite glaring there. And 1080p, I think at this point you can basically assume that you're CPU limited. We're into the 40s now. And the artifacts are still there, but they are somewhat lessened, but obviously still there. Now, this is just basically an automated benchmark, which is designed to stress CPU. So you're kind of traversing faster than you would be in standard gameplay. So I went back to 4K. And went back into just sort of standard gameplay. And it holds up a lot better, I think, but there is still that kind of, I think you'd call it a warbling effect there, Alex.
I like my warbles.
Around the UI elements there. But, ultimately, we are looking at like Starfield at, you know, between 30 to 40 FPS, producing a very, very smooth, consistently smooth output at 120, which is kind of nuts.
Yeah, it's a great proof of concept. I think from my hands-on feeling of what 30 to 120 feels like even on a controller, I probably would not like it. But that is like, because so you could inject reflex into a game. You could turn on reflex in a game if the game natively has reflex. Special K also allows you to inject. I haven't fully investigated whether it functions exactly like reflex, but something that is going to be a lot like reflex, at least, based upon the naming and the way Caldeans described it, into a game. So you could at least get the equivalent reflex thing, but it wouldn't change the fact that you're still manually queuing up all these frames and holding them for as long as you are at such a low base frame rate, which is a big part of Rich's whole MFG examination in his videos. And it's not gonna. This is definitely not mouse player territory, to say the least.
No. I mean, when we are in low frame rate territory, then obviously there's going to be a latency impact on that. And I mean, I kind of see this as a really nice thing to experiment with that may have application in certain titles for you. And it's certainly a really interesting demonstration of the concept of taking a variable frame rate and converting it to what looks to be a perceptibly smooth 120 output. Right. I think that's really, really cool. You know, the concept of being able to take a game that's running at an arbitrary frame rate and produce a convincing output that's locked at 120 here. You know, I've only tested 2 games, but even so, it's a really interesting demo. But as you say, Alex, there's 2 components to frame generation, of course, latency and quality of the output. Mm-hmm. And that was the other thing that I asked the developer, which was, well, question 1, how are you doing this? And number 2, what would be your chosen latency mitigation strategy for this? Because that's where I'm feeling it at the moment. But even so, really cool. I suggest people buy Lossless Scaling because it's not exactly expensive, and give it a go if you've got a high refresh rate display. I think you'll be quite impressed. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, final news topic of the week before we move on to some interesting topics with John. But Oliver, this one's quite interesting, right? Basically, Apple has announced a new Mac Studio. You have the original Mac Studio, I believe.
Yeah.
And let's just say that the spec options on offer are kind of odd, right?
It is very unusual. So I'll explain my interest in this first of all, which is that I've had an M1 Ultra Mac Studio for the last 3 years or so. And that's been like one of my favorite computers I've ever had. It's so fast, it's so sleek, it's so slim, it's so quiet. It's a wonderful computer to use. Tons of memory for all kinds of uses. That's really a fantastic computer. But Apple's been moving really quickly with their M series of chips, and I've been looking maybe to upgrade. The M2 Ultra came out about 2 years ago, and that was like a pretty minor upgrade over M1 Ultra, like 20%, 30% CPU, GPU improvements. And the Ultra chips, by the way, they're 2 Max chips connected over a silicon interposer with 2.5 terabytes per second of bandwidth between them. So that's basically like a situation where the Max chips are Apple's biggest chips, and they basically connect 2 of them to form one chip that is monolithic in software, is perceived as one chip by the operating system, but is much more powerful. But when the M3 generation came out a year and a half ago, the weird thing is the M3 Max chip didn't appear to have a silicon interposer. So it seemed like, okay, this is going to skip this generation of product. But it turns out that actually wasn't quite correct because, like Rich mentioned, Apple has announced a new series of Mac Studios in addition to the MacBook Air on the same day, but the Mac Studios are what's of interest here. And they include an M4 Max. Okay, that's normal. And the step-up chip is not an M4 Ultra, but actually an M3 Ultra chip, which is totally bizarre. So it seems like that M3 Max die shot that was going around, did it actually have an interposer connection on it? Either that or they're producing a new version of the M3 Max chip, possibly on a different process. I heard some reporting that was on N3E instead of N3B, possibly. But in either case, there probably is some funny business going on here because this computer seems like it should have shipped a while ago with maybe an M3 Max and an M3 Ultra chip, but that wasn't the case. They have this M4 Max chip and now this M3 Ultra chip in the same lineup of computers, with the M3 Ultra costing considerably more. But I think actually, you know, in performance terms, it's kind of a huge step up. In a lot of respects, Apple's been moving really quickly. So relative to my M1 Ultra, It's got about an 80% faster CPU, about a 160% faster GPU, according to Apple. Ultimately, the thing that pushes me off this is just like the M4 series is obviously more recent, and you actually have substantially higher single-core CPU performance in the M4 series, which is a significant bottleneck for some of the work that I do, some of the exports that I do here. That kind of leaves a bad taste in the mouth. So personally, I'm kind of thinking maybe I wait for the M5 Ultra and I have this computer for like 5 years or something. I just wait for that ultimate upgrade there. But the other thing that's weird about this computer and potentially quite compelling about this computer is they're offering it because they have this unified memory configuration, right? These computers have massive pools of memory. So my Mac Studio has 120 gigabytes of RAM, which 3 years ago was like, a pretty massive amount of RAM, unified memory. So that can be used by graphics. That's obviously can be key for games, can be very important for games, very, very important for AI workflows in particular. That's obviously another big focus area. This new computer can support 512 gigabytes of unified memory. And if
ridiculous.
Yeah, if you kick that in, that is an insane amount of money. I'm not going to say how much money it is, but if you were to pursue that, that would be an intense amount of money. Personally, I'd probably go with 256 if I was going to configure that. So yeah, ultimately, I think this is kind of interesting that Apple is shipping this product in a kind of staggered fashion, and they're not shipping presumably an M4 Ultra chip here in this generation of products. But for a lot of users, I could totally see this being a really compelling computer, especially for local AI use. Like you can fit the full 4-bit DeepSeek R1 model in one computer with 512 gigabytes of RAM. That is pretty insane. Before then, you'd have to have various server configurations and these kinds of crazy Frankenstein computers to try to get that running on a single client machine. In this case, Apple's just going to sell it to you now for a ridiculous price, but still, they'll just sell you a computer that can run that flat out, probably at a pretty reasonable amount of tokens per second. It has hardware RT support as well. It's the first Mac Studio with hardware RT support in both the M4 Max and M3 Ultra configurations. That should be great for titles like the upcoming Assassin's Creed Shadows, which is shipping day and date on Macs, which should be really, really good there. And yeah, in general, it'd probably be a good deal faster for me. They're quoting a 40% advantage of the Final Cut performance and things like that. But yeah, I think I'll wait. I think I can hold off on this generation. Thankfully, cooler, calmer heads have prevailed. So I think I'll hold
I love
off.
the concept of 512 gigs of memory being able to contain this hugely advanced AI model, but then you open Chrome, run some tabs, and it just becomes instantly stupid.
Yeah.
In fact, Alex, going back to Star Trek, the original series, Captain Kirk destroying supercomputers by using logic.
Making them divide by zero.
He could have just opened Chrome, a few tabs.
It's the simple way. Yeah.
Let's sort of get to the bottom line. An M3 Ultra versus an M4 Max. I guess the M3 Ultra is in theory, the better option. Weirdly,
yes.
Right.
It should be better. I mean, it's funny you bring up the example of opening Chrome because opening up individual Chrome tabs should be ever so slightly faster on the M4 chip, I would presume. Unless you had like a crazy website that could take advantage of like the 32 CPU cores that are on the M3 Ultra, which is a pretty massive amount, but it should be better. I mean, in most circumstances, the M4 series of chips, the primary advantage there, as far as I see it, is you go from 4 gigahertz as a maximum clock rate on the performance cores to 4.4 gigahertz. You also have an improvement in performance per clock. Those are things that I was expecting to see in an M3, rather in a Mac Studio update with the M4 Ultra chip, but it looks like they're skipping that. So it is going to be better. I mean, they're quoting some crazy figures here, like 22 streams of 8K ProRes footage at once in Final Cut, things like this that are frankly beyond any conceivable need that most people could have. And,
yeah, what are you doing?
I don't know.
What are you doing?
If you're editing a 22-way 8K at multicam in Final Cut, it should be able to keep up.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
United Nations here.
Yeah. But I think part of this also just like, in my own view, and I think probably in your view as well, Rich, with you having an M1 Pro based MacBook, I believe as well. These M series chips have just aged like wine. They run so well. My computer is still in fantastic shape. It runs, I mean, anything I can put on it in terms of a professional workload, it just screams through. So I feel like a lot of people who are in my position who might have an older M1 Max or M1 Ultra based chip, one of these computers from like over 3 years ago in some cases, they're probably looking at these computers and saying, yeah, that would be a lot faster, but also there's not really a workload that currently is pushing my computer hard, such that I would have a qualitatively different experience if I had a faster computer. So I think a lot of people are in that position right now. Apple's just outdone themselves in some respects, and it's making it a little bit harder to incentivize an upgrade in some cases. Whereas with the Intel computers, I always felt like, okay, this thing is pokey, it's throttling, there are all these problems. I never felt like that with the M1 series of chips.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, John's just bought a 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1. I'm not sure which one. I think it might be the Pro. And he's just blown away by it. It's still really good. I've got no need to upgrade from my M1 Pro, I don't think, which is possibly an issue for Apple. But it is what it is, right? Anyway, awesome stuff. Let's move on. Okay, then. So now we're going to switch to a separately recorded session that I did with John, because John has got some stuff he wants to talk about. It's pretty good stuff, actually. John, hello.
Hey, Rich. Yeah, stepping in for a little bit this week since I couldn't make the main show, but there was some good stuff. There was one great thing announced this week, and then something else I've been wanting to talk about. So
okay, let's
start with that announcement.
Let's talk Tony Hawk.
Yes, finally. It's been teased for so long, including incorrectly in Japan, where they wrote April 3rd by accident because they didn't have a translator check it. But it was revealed on March 4th, so 3/4, according to the U.S. date there.
Right.
And it is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3+4, which, I'll be honest, for a while, I really didn't think there was much chance of this happening after what they did with the previous studio that was involved with bringing Tony Hawk 1 and 2 out.
Yeah.
But they have done this. It looks like Iron Galaxy's involved this time.
Interesting.
Which is interesting. But it's very promising. Tony Hawk's 1 and 2, I think, was one of the best, arguably one of the best in the series as a result. It took those great courses from the original 2 games and breathed new life into it. And that seems to be what they're trying to do here as well. And yeah, there's one bad point, but mostly it's all good stuff. So the bad point, arguably, this is variable, is that for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, they did confirm that it doesn't have the full campaign of Tony Hawk 4.
Right.
It just has the traditional 2-minute runs with the objectives stuff. So Tony Hawk 4 is where they started to experiment with expanding the game a little bit, but I never loved that part of 4. It got good with Tony Hawk's Underground, I would say. So it's not a huge loss for me, but I think some people might be disappointed. But the rest of this stuff is great. The visual upgrade is significant. In this, there's nothing like crazy going on in terms of tech here. You got your nice screen space reflections. You can see right away. But like just the level of detail is similar to 1 and 2 remake, where it's just the courses look awesome. New life is breathed into them, the lighting, the detail. It's so fun to see those familiar places that we recognize from those previous games, but with all that extra detail. And this was from the golden age of Tony Hawk, I would say. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 especially. 2 and 3 are my favorite in the series by far. And 3 was the first one to run at 60 frames per second, interestingly. Because everything prior to that, it was PlayStation, Dreamcast, PC. All those versions were capped at 30. But once they went to Tony Hawk 3 on PS2, we got 60 FPS.
Nice.
And online play even back in the day.
Wow.
It was one of the earliest examples of PS2 online play. You could actually play over the internet. And I would assume all of that stuff has made the jump. And they actually show some clips of the original PS2 game in this trailer. And then they sort of cut to the new stuff, which I thought was fun to see. Because at the time, it looked great. It was like, wow, this is a huge upgrade over the prior games. But now, it's been a while.
Yes.
So it's we've come a long way from that. So
of course, that was the great upgrade period, wasn't it? The PS1 to PS2 leap was probably one of the biggest technological jumps ever.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because when you look at this, it's like the leap from the PS2 game to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 isn't that far removed from the leap from Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 to 3.
Right.
Like if you compare PlayStation to PS2 and then PS2 to like PS5, it's kind of a similar leap in terms of fidelity almost, which says a lot because that was only like a period of 2 or 3 years back in the day. And now it's like 25 years later, we get a similar leap. Because I think the generation of Tony Hawk that shipped on PS3, that PS3 era, they had a lot of issues, right? Mm-hmm. That was when they did. So American Wasteland got a 360 port, but it was like barely upgraded over the Xbox version, which was already 720p, and the PS2 version was 480p widescreen. And then we got Project 8, which was okay, but the frame rate was really unstable. So it tried to be 60, but it often fell. And then for Proving Grounds after that, they just went to 30 FPS. So they gave up and went back to 30. And then they tried to do Tony Hawk HD, and that was also 30, and it was like Unreal Engine 3, and it was not great. And then we finally get the frame rate back when they remade 1 and 2, and that should continue here. I just hope we get the 120 hertz mode again.
Right.
Because if you remember, they added that to PS5 and Xbox Series X. I can't remember if the S version had it actually, but they updated it. 120 FPS support was included.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything you're particularly looking forward to with this based on what you've seen so far? Any features you want beyond 120 hertz?
Well, they did kind of indicate that there's going to be both classic and new music in there. And even better, Taco Bell's in here. Just saying, they actually play the gong when you pass by it while grinding. I don't know if you caught it, Rich, but the spirit of E3 lived on this past week. It was a Live Moss 2025. Live Moss Live.
Right.
Taco Bell put on an E3 style press conference. It was over an hour long. They revealed new products. They're bringing back the 7-layer burrito. Okay. And they revealed that they're in this game, and you can see it in the trailer.
Well, this sort of reference just completely escapes me because I've only ever been to one in the UK, which was in Earl's Court in London, and I haven't seen one anywhere else. But, I don't get out much.
There's one here in this area, but it's locked behind the American military base.
Okay.
I ain't trying to get in there. But so...
Is this, some sort of terrorism prevention measure?
Possibly. But yeah, so it looks like it's coming out in July then.
Right.
So I'm going to be there with a DF Retro style video on this.
Absolutely.
I have to be.
I guess obviously Vicarious Visions probably couldn't handle this project, bearing in mind everything that's happened. But I'm kind of curious as to where they go from this. Do you think Tony Hawk could come back as something new, or will they just continue to revitalize older franchise entries?
I would love to see them attempt a new one.
Yeah.
But it's tough. I actually think the underground model that they played with would make a lot of sense again. And then beyond that, when you actually look back at what underground is, it sort of has the underpinnings of what would become like the quote unquote Forza Horizon formula, right? Where here's this map, you can go around the map and do things, but then there's challenges, events all over the place, right? It worked well for Tony Hawk, and I think it could work again. I think they've done with this release and the one before it, you've already done the 2-minute challenge thing again and brought that back, and I love that. But, I don't know that they would do that for a brand new entry. Right? So there's a lot of potential there. We'll see. I don't know. They've got the train rolling again. I think Tony Hawk's 1 and 2 sold pretty well from what I understand.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope this does as well.
Okay.
Because these games are the ultimate score attack titles.
Yeah. We don't have so many of those anymore, do we?
No. I mean, I spent so much time skating virtually on Skate Street Ventura and Tony Hawk's 2, going for those gigantic combos. I think I strung together like 1 million combo before. It was really tough. Just keep it going with the manuals, and there was the special. I just get excited talking about Tony Hawk. So, but yes, it's coming. check it out.
Okay, good stuff. John, you've got to talk about this because this device is quite remarkable that you've been testing here. And I kind of consider the fact that it exists at all to be quite astonishing, but tell us more.
Yes. So I've been putting this through its paces, and I finally am ready to talk about it. It's called the Scalable Video Switch. This is very much intended for the retro-minded amongst us, so obviously, you know, the rise of retro gaming, people are getting into, you know, RGB, even though that was a thing in Europe back in the day, obviously.
Yeah.
It wasn't for most Americans. And you've got all these different consoles. You've got, you know, component video, you got VGA options, you know, S video, composite, all this kind of stuff, right?
Yep.
So currently, if you have a bunch of consoles, you know, before this, you'd have like, all right, maybe I have my component switcher here. Maybe I have a SCART switcher here, you know, and possibly even an S video switcher somewhere, depending on what you need, right? And you kind of link all these together, and already the market in that situation was not great. The best one for this for a while was the G-SCART series, which those were excellent, but they were very expensive and very hard to get. Very hard to get. Like, they just didn't make them often. So if you were like, oh, I need one of these right now, you're going to be waiting. China started to produce some that you can get on AliExpress that are okay-ish.
Right.
I actually picked some up and played with them, but they had a bunch of weird little flaws that made them frustrating to use, where like sometimes it would just like, you'd flip it on and the image would be all red, and you have to flip off the console, flip it on again, and it would come back, you know, things like that. Like just random little glitches that made it slightly irritating. I didn't love that. And then a lot of the other stuff was like manual switches, you know, old switches from back in the day. The SVS, however, is a custom designed switch that is designed to allow users to pick the exact modules that they want and create like this monstrous customized switch system.
Okay.
So let's say you have like 3 SCART devices, 2 component devices, an S-Video device, and then you want to do like Dreamcast over VGA, right?
Yep.
You can do all of that with this one switch. You just buy the appropriate modules, put them all together, and then you get the appropriate output modules. And it'll run every signal through every type of output. It's all on you and your display as to what it will accept. But so if you just want to, and it even has deep integration with things like, if you have a RetroTink 4K, for instance, and you use the VGA style DE15 output, it can send data over the cable, which allows you to assign individual modules to a specific profile on the Tink 4K. So when you flip on your game console, it automatically signals to the Tink 4K which profile to load, and everything is just automatic.
So was it like some sort of collaboration there with Mike?
Yeah. You worked with Mike to get that done.
Okay.
So that's super cool. And then just the quality of the image, it's basically perfect. Like you get this super clean. It's about as clean as you could possibly ever want from this analog video stuff.
Nice.
And in my setup with all these different consoles and all the different potential displays that I'm using, you know, I actually have 3 output modules, you know, I have 2 for each CRT set up behind me, and then a third one that goes to the Tink. Right. But you could do more, and you can get as many of these as you want. And so basically what you get with each module is a little circuit board with the input on it, or the output. He even sells these little, I guess, Toslink input and output modules. So if you want optical audio in and out, you can get that too,
Right.
which is cool. And those clip onto each one, and you basically slide each one together at a time, then you kind of screw it down at the end. So it basically allows you to put these in the order you want, and you can put as many as you want up to, I have to confirm that actually, 32.
Right.
Wait. Oh yeah. Okay. So he says it supports up to 248 inputs. However, the maximum number of inputs can be stacked together in a single stack is 32. So to expand beyond that, you need an expansion module to create additional stacks of 32 each.
Right.
That's not out yet, the expansion module, but currently you can do up to 32, which I think should suffice in most cases.
Yeah. I think this is
Except for that
remarkable.
one guy in Dubai or wherever he was.
Yeah.
He got the
I mean, I think this product is remarkable, John, for a very, very simple reason. If you think about, how big is the retro market? I'd say it's probably quite sizable at this point, but, a lot of it is going to be people doing like Mister or emulation, that kind of thing. So we're already talking about a product that's going to appeal to a subset of a market. And that subset of the market is people that are using essentially original hardware. Right, and so which I would say is probably quite a specialist part of the collector market that's doing that. So therefore, to produce a device like this that's aimed specifically for that subset of almost a niche possibly, there isn't. I can't imagine there's going to be massive volume in it, right? But at the same time, this product exists. And it exists because of the passion and dedication, first of all, the creators that make it, and secondly, the passion and dedication of the people that are into these games to the point that they're preserving original consoles from like 30 years ago. And, all of this is coming together to create magic, basically, superb devices that are better than the quality of similar devices we had when those consoles were actually out and about and relevant. It's astonishing.
It really, really is. And man, I just cannot say enough good things about the work that they've done here, the quality of the engineering. And I've talked to the creator about this, and it really was a case where he personally wanted something like this.
Right.
And there was no option. So, asking around to the community, he invested a ton of his own money into just engineering and designing this thing for this specific niche audience. And here it is. It freaking works.
Awesome.
So, as Adrian might say. So the prices then, it's not cheap, but that's expected given what this is. But depending on your needs, it can be very affordable. So there's the control module, which is the central point. This is where everything is connected to. You have outputs go on one side, inputs go on the other side, basically, and it sits in the middle here. It has a remote connection. This is where power is input into, all that stuff. That's $40. From there, then, you have to buy individual modules for your input, and that includes both the output modules and the input modules. The input modules are $30 to $35 each.
This is all pretty reasonable for a
think
low
so too,
volume
right?
device.
Exactly. For a low volume device, it's extremely reasonable, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then the output modules they're mostly $25 each, except for the VGA one is $35.
Wow.
So, that's a little bit more complicated, the VGA one.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
And I tested this even with like HD resolutions, like I was doing 40p over SCART from the PS2 through this thing, outputting via VGA into a VGA monitor. And it just works, right?
Wow.
I was getting Xbox over component and VGA up to its, 1080i output and all that. You're able to just kind of send anything through it, and there's no real visible signal loss. You're kind of at the behest of the cables themselves, since you're dealing with analog video here. I have had a few situations where I'm like, why is this image kind of noisy or something? And it turns out it's a cable fault, right? Swap the cable, you're good. So you really do have to pay attention to the quality of your cables with analog devices. This brings back memories of the monster cable, I guess, but I don't know how good those ever were, but it really mattered a lot back then. It matters less in the age of digital. Although with digital cables, when they go out, it's very frustrating because they just stop working or they do weird stuff.
I'll tell you what, though, John, I'm just suddenly reminded of that bizarre era where everyone thought that you could get better quality HDMI by getting a $200 cable, which was almost hilarious back in the day.
There is a bit of a quality thing with HDMI these days because of HDMI 2.1 though, right?
Yep.
Where like if these manufacturers skimp out on what the cable can do, they don't wire it up well, you actually will not get the full capabilities of HDMI 2.1.
Yeah.
And also long runs are troublesome, right?
Error correction, that kind of thing as well. Yeah, there's a lot
Exactly.
going on there, but back in the day it was like,
it
720p
worked
and
or didn't.
yeah. Well, this all looks really, really quite splendid. So yeah, I'm glad that it actually exists. There's just so much going on in the retro market at the moment. It's just really brilliant stuff.
I think I said to you yesterday that this product is so good that it's like, the Lord has come down from heaven and bestowed this majestic piece of hardware upon us, is the kind of like sentiment I might say. This is truly like one of the best pieces of hardware that I've ever used, like in this kind of retro setup. It is absolutely amazing. Like just a genuinely stunning achievement in terms of what it offers. Like you have no idea how frustrating dealing with all these inputs and outputs can be in a big retro setup. And anybody that's been there will know and be like, oh yeah, like this is, unfortunately it's currently sold out,
Right.
but keep an eye on this page. It is a single creator. It's a small dude. It's just a small business. I mean, working on this stuff. I don't think he's actually small. Just the business is small. But if you have any needs like this is right now, this is the one to get. Especially whether you're using CRTs or you get the Retro Tank or something or any of the other scalers, this is the way to go.
Great. Excellent. Cheers. Okay. Well, thanks, John. We're going to move on now. Okay, so now it's time for supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week I ask our supporters on Patreon to pose their questions for us. I choose the best, or rather the ones that we are best equipped to answer. A lot of PC stuff this week for obvious reasons. Let's begin with this one from Some Guy Person. I keep seeing people who want to purchase a 5090, yet they have a relatively anemic CPU in their system that will hold back performance. What is your CPU guidance for people that want to buy a 5080 or 5090 instead of going for a $2,000 plus GPU that nobody can buy? What can people go for that will improve their experience for a bit less money? Well, that's an interesting question. CPU guidance, first of all, for a 5080 or 5090. The answer is the fastest one you can afford, always.
Yes.
And you've got to be looking at this point, an X3D product, I think. The thing is, you can be CPU limited even there, depending on how you're deploying the settings in a game, right?
Yeah.
This is the weird thing about hardware balance. You can be CPU limited, you can be GPU limited. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, I think anything other than the best of the best for a 5000 or even a 4090. We talked about when the 4090 came out that it was supreme. I mean, it's right in between the 5080 and the 5090. Yep. So it makes sense that also, in that case, was also supremely CPU limited in a number of times and titles, depending upon the way you deploy settings like you describe. And I think you can really only get the best of the best. I would not recommend someone, for example, with you can see this build sometimes out there, and I see comments by it, but like the 5800 X3D with like I've seen with a 4090 and a 5090, and that's like it's a really good CPU. I would never say anything really negative about it, but if you look at the performance comparisons that we've done and other outlets have done versus the later X3Ds processors in games, those are really big wins. Then you have the PCIe on top, getting upgraded for Blackwell, which might end up being helpful in certain games over a certain amount of period of time, and just a whole lot of other stuff that comes with that new package. And I really wouldn't expect anything else. If you are still on a middling processor, it's not middling, it's a really amazing processor, but if you're on a not latest X3D, I would maybe wait it out unless you have a GPU that is really causing you problems in games, and because otherwise you're looking at more like a larger fundamental rebuilding of the entire PC, in which case maybe don't spend a whole bunch of money on the currently very overpriced Blackwell GPUs, wait a little bit, see how the market settles, all these other things. Because right now I don't feel like there's a lot of things that are coming into place exactly. We need to see things settle out a bit.
Oliver, you've got a 5090 paired with a 13700.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. Are you seeing any bottlenecking there? It's difficult because when you're in the midst of gameplay, unless you've got like Reaver Tuner running, and even then it's not clear that you're CPU limited. I guess you look at GPU utilization for some idea.
I think it really depends on how you play games. And for me personally, I don't personally notice it that much because of how I'm setting up the game. So to explain, like, the more real frames you want to render, the more the CPU is going to be an issue. But vice versa is also true.
It's an interesting point.
Right? So like if you're doing 4x frame gen to 240 hertz or something, most CPUs are going to suffice for that purpose in most titles, I would say. So, for me, like personally, my 13700K in most scenarios probably is going to bottleneck me in CPU limited scenarios by 20 to 30% or something like that relative to 9800X3D. That's probably within the range of typical performance variance across titles there. But in those games, I'm usually fine with just turning on frame gen. Like I was playing Space Marine 2, I beat it about a month ago, and I used 2x frame gen to hit like 165 hertz, something in that vicinity there, capped down from 170 hertz on a 170 hertz panel. And I had that instead of like 120 hertz to 140 hertz or something without frame generation, right? That was a fine trade-off for my purposes. So in that case, there really is no difference between those two CPUs if you're using frame generation.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here for sure.
Yeah, you could use it without frame generation, of course, on an 9800X3 and maybe end up with a better experience in aggregate, but it doesn't seem like that big of a downgrade to me to turn on frame generation and have a good experience there. But also, like, there are some titles like World of Warcraft, which I play like regretfully and shamefully sometimes, where for sure I can feel a difference between those two CPUs. So on the 13700K, I feel stutters, I feel issues at even at 144 hertz on different panels. And there you don't have frame generation natively, but there's no CPU that exists in the world that wouldn't leave you CPU limited to some degree with a 5090 with any kind of reasonable settings in World of Warcraft, outside of like 8 times MSA with RT shadows and things like that turned on. So I'd say that to me, at least, it depends. Like just saying in the abstract, oh, you're CPU limited or not CPU limited. Like to me, that doesn't really make not obviously to disagree, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the scenarios in which these GPUs are being used, the resolutions they're being used, and the refresh rates that are being used, and the technologies that are being used are so variable between games that it's hard to say a hard and fast rule. But I would definitely agree, like for sure, upgrade your CPU before you run to the 5090. I would agree with that, but I'd also say like it depends on what you're willing to concede in terms of fake frames, let's say, in a lot of titles.
I think another thing to bear in mind is the concept of, well, here, there is the concept that you've got to be running your game flat out at maximum utilization from start to finish, when actually there is a much more nuanced way that a lot of people will be gaming, which is to set a target frame rate which is comfortably within the bounds of the CPU and the GPU, and you just have a wonderfully consistent experience throughout. I mean, that's another way of looking at it. You don't need to be running your CPU and your GPU at turbo nutter speeds just because you want to max out your components. There's much to be said for simply having a good, consistent experience that's within the comfortable capabilities of your PC, which is kind of like how consoles do it, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
When they're running at 30 FPS, you can be guaranteed that there's going to be a lot of time where the GPU is underutilized, even the CPU. Going to 60, the CPU is going to be doing a lot more work, as and obviously the GPU too. But it's all about balance, really. Yeah, interesting one. Let's move on to the next question from the mighty Ethan. Hey DF! With how much the ML upscalers have improved their handling of elements without motion vectors, would it now be possible / desirable for Nvidia and AMD to release a driver level toggle for DLSS and FSR to allow ML upscaling even on games that don't natively implement it? Or if not upscaling, what about driver level MLAA? I think AMD already did that, or some variant of it. Anyway, do you think it would be possible to get decent image quality that way, or would trying to treat the entire image without the normal background data be too prone to errors? I'd love your thoughts. Cheers! ! I'll go to you on this one, Alex, but it's interesting that we do actually have an example of this already, which is AutoSR from Microsoft, which we have covered, which had variable results, but ultimately was quote unquote okay / pretty good in some scenarios.
Yeah, it's such a shame it's stuck to that platform. And we can't actually give it a better diagnosis and go through, whatever. But I think this is an interesting, maybe the plus point that could be added into the drivers. I also agree with them. As I showed in the FSR4 presentation, as well as if you just have used DLSS the last couple of years, for things that don't have motion vectors, it does a pretty good job. Now, the question is, we're seeing that in an image that otherwise has a lot of things with motion vectors. So the less precision that it has on the things that lack motion vectors doesn't stand out as much. But if the entire image was maybe composited in that way, maybe we'd have a lot more issues. So it could be really good. It could also be really bad. I think there may be in the future reshade versions of something that is like this. I've maybe heard of someone behind the scenes working on something like that. So it may be not even coming from Nvidia or AMD themselves. But I think this is generally like a good idea. If Microsoft can do it, Nvidia and AMD definitely now could, and it would be probably in their benefit to have it as like one of the upscaling options that is present in the driver. You already have the ability to choose like FSR scaling, RC, what do they call it? RCAS scaling. You've got like on the Nvidia side, you've got, the bilinear, integer, it should just be another one of those scaling options that the driver allows you to enable. And I think it could potentially offer great experiences on the cheap,
Mm-hmm. Thoughts, Oliver?
I would like that. Lossless Scaling already has an interesting machine learning based spatial upscaler, and Sony has one for PS4 software on PS5 Pro there that actually interestingly has a significant performance cost. Looks okay. Obviously not anywhere close to DLSS or indeed Microsoft's Auto SR upscaler. I would really like to see that on PC available more broadly beyond just that Qualcomm chip, that Snapdragon X Elite that's so maligned in some quarters, but not widely available and perhaps not widely useful for certainly for desktop computer use. But I'd be more interested to see it, like I said a couple months ago, I think, more interested to see it for console software, which is by its nature inherently kind of fixed in a way that this kind of technique could really improve. Whereas with PC software, outside of a few maybe limited titles, you generally have more configurability. You have more ability to improve the visual outcome there, improve the resolution, obviously, in a way that's not really possible for console software. So for me, I'm really interested in its use, in particular for kind of these fixed software packages on console that you can't really adjust.
Right.
I'm intrigued by this reshade thing you're talking about, Alex, because if we look at Auto SR, there are weaknesses to it. The HUD, for example, is going to be basically the machine learning will be based on a 2D image, right? Mm-hmm. It has no concept of the components of that image. So in Auto SR, for example, there are things you need to be aware of. HUD elements can look a bit weird. If you're using some post-processing effects like film grain, for example, you've got to turn it off because it looks awful with Auto SR. It really does. So I'm curious, would Reshade be able to kind of like go behind some of these effects, or does it have a bit more awareness of the makeup of the image?
With depth, it would. Yes, it would have more awareness of the full image. It would at least presumably have depth and then final color. And then it could have a better understanding of things where they're composited thereafter. Usually UI is not in there, which is why you see the issues that you see crop up in games when you plug in like a depth of field shader into Reshade. But I think also there could be easily masking done. That could be contextual, like it would, based upon the game, it could know where like the HUD usually pops up. And then when it sees in a frame that the HUD pops up there, based upon the mask, it could start turning off for that bit of the frame. I think these things are all doable, and I think it would be great to also see one that just doesn't do upscaling, but also does maybe AA, anti-aliasing. We've seen DLDSR from Nvidia, but what if there was also like a SMAA kind of equivalent, but done with machine learning, so it's even better. I think this is a big field that there's a lot of use cases that you can imagine.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Galaxy Goer. ADF crew, why doesn't the PC evolve to a more game console or Mac/Halo Strix style usage of RAM? 12 gigabyte GPU is recommended for games because that's what consoles use. But then PC users are asked to spend a lot more for 16 gigs of expensive DDR5 memory. I understand how x86 CPUs and motherboards are not built for this and the VRAM is different, but I feel like these are legacy issues. Sure, a user on PC would still need more, but we can't effectively mix them in games, it seems. Why is it that games need 28 gigs, 12 VRAM, 16 RAM to do what consoles do with 12? Thanks. Keep up the good work. Alex, this is the age-old question. Is unified memory going to come to PC? And the answer is inevitably kind of no, really, isn't it? It's just the way it is.
I mean, at least in the current design of way a motherboard works and the way a CPU works, the things that a CPU requires for its memory are not the exact same things that a GPU requires for its memory. And so if you're spending to get super high bandwidth memory that is shared between the two of them, you're kind of wasting that bandwidth on a CPU, which won't be benefiting from it, while also hurting the CPU because it's higher latency than what you would get from a lot lower powered memory like your DDR4s and 5s. And it also doesn't fit at all within the paradigm that, what you're talking about with a console or with a Mac or a Strix is it's just like one company dictating the entire existence of a product. Whereas a PC you get for yourself, even one built by someone else like Dell or Alienware or whomever makes these things these days, Origin, they are combining components from a variety of manufacturers, which is what the PC Open Standard is about. And unless there was some sort of motherboard design that accommodated this, and I think I'd be open to it, it doesn't really seem to have a place both on like a pure tech perspective, it's like an efficiency of money perspective, and also an innovation perspective. Like otherwise you only have one lockdown platform, and that's a Mac, right? That's not exactly what a PC is. There's obviously huge benefits though toward it. Oliver's talked about it like a bunch of times like that. That's HBM though on your side though, right, Oliver? Or is it? What is it?
No, it's LPDDR5 on the Macs.
LPDDR5.
Yes.
Very fast though, right? Like the bandwidth is like...
on the Mac Studios, it's 800 gigabytes per second.
Yeah, it's very fast. Yeah. Okay. And it's also very expensive.
Very expensive.
Yeah. Like, like there it makes sense. And there's a use case for that in like a production scenario, a machine learning scenario. But for the average user, it doesn't make that much sense. And there are some duplication issues that exist as a result of it. Like you're describing, we need to first have things resident in system memory that are then transferred over the PCI bus into VRAM. That is a necessary kind of staging point for this all. But I think that is actually the more legacy thing. I think Windows and the motherboards could evolve into the future where it doesn't need to be resident first in system memory to go from your NVMe into your GPU. I think that is actually the one unnecessary step currently that motherboards of the future and Windows of the future could override. If you think about it, your NVMe is right next to your GPU. Why does it have to go to system memory first and then to your GPU's memory? It's actually, that's the more legacy component, and I don't think unifying memory is the way forward. So I think it's actually two separate pools, taking advantage of the advantages of both of them. One's a lot closer to the GPU, that's separate, and then actually just having our SSDs feed our GPUs in a much more efficient way.
Interesting. Oliver, you use unified memory on your key system. What do you think about this?
I do. I think it's an interesting idea, but fundamentally, like unified memory it's a useful paradigm for specialty products. Like when you look at a Mac Studio or a Strix Halo like framework design, those are non-upgradable computers that are built to have svelte form factors, low power consumption. And they're really strong choices for some workloads like AI workloads. That has some utility for gaming, obviously, but that's a non-configurable computer fundamentally. If I wanted a really huge GPU in a Mac Studio, I couldn't really get it. It's not like a PC where you can mix and match things as appropriate. On the consumer end in the Windows land, I think it makes a lot more sense for like laptops potentially or handhelds, things like that. Obviously, we see SoCs all the time for those kinds of systems, but in particular, these kinds of massive configurations like the Strix Halo configuration. But on desktops, I'm not really seeing it. In particular, you have to figure out a way to wire like a 256-bit bus through a motherboard with replaceable RAM modules, which we don't really see. In particular, on the framework side of things, they use soldered modules. They couldn't really figure out how to do it, so they use soldered modules there. So in general, I think it has some utility. I think it has big advantages for certain kinds of workloads, but the fact that it's ultimately not really a configurable, swappable setup in the way that people expect on desktop computers, that's not ultimately, it just doesn't really jibe with it. It could be quite usable though for gaming laptops. Like I could imagine a Strix Halo based gaming laptop, that'd be a pretty good experience, but in general, not really for desktops.
Cool. Okay. Let's move on. Interesting question here from Alex's Ray Trace Bottom.
Well, if you insist.
With Nvidia's, let's be honest, disastrous launch, are we witnessing the beginning of the end for Nvidia as a gaming company? I'm not trying to be overly dramatic, but with 90% of their revenue now coming from AI, it's difficult to ignore the possibility that the gaming side of the company is suffering as a result. It's hard to believe they could fumble this badly unless something fundamental has shifted in their culture and priorities. So, well, this is an interesting question, isn't it, Alex? And indeed, your ray-traced bottom. Because, obviously Blackwell's come out. We've got the 5090, which is, a decent chunk better than a 4090, but costs a lot more. And then no 4090 equivalent. And then everything else is essentially, as you called it in your CES coverage, almost like a refresh of the super refresh of the 40 series. And it's culminated in the 5070, which is basically, let's say it like it is. It's a 4070 super, give or take. And the concept that there's any take at all is remarkable. A 4070 super, give or take, with a price cut and DLSS 4. The hardware side of things does seem to be not as robust as previous launches, let's put it that way. Do you think we are witnessing the beginning of the end of Nvidia as a gaming company? My personal view on this is nobody really knows whether this AI thing is sustainable going forward, whether Nvidia will continue to have this gigantic lead, and it still makes gigantic amounts of money from gaming. So I don't think it is the beginning of the end, but I certainly am concerned about Blackwell.
Yeah, I'm concerned about Blackwell too. I also think if the 5070 is the signs of what we should expect from a 5060 and 5060 Ti, well then what presumably AMD is going to respond with in those segments, they'll have way more memory or something like that and be just as good in a lot of ways, if not better, and then be cheaper, then, that's really bad actually for NVIDIA. And I think the hardware side this time around is the big letdown. Software side, though, they only show evidence of them wanting to push everything forward. So I don't think so. I also think, I don't know Jensen at all. I don't know the man. But I think, he's probably got a lot of his pride invested into the GPU market, which is where the company got its start. And I think giving that up, that position of pride and prestige over time, probably doesn't make too much sense. I think they'd always want to be dominant. So I don't think so, but I definitely do not like the current hardware direction that Blackwell's gone in for price and essentially what you get versus the previous generation. I don't think it is up to NVIDIA's own standards, actually. So there's that.
Yeah, the 5070, I can't help but think, right? If it was a $499 product and you could buy it for $499, I think actually it would have received, and no comparisons with 4090 performance. This is one of the biggest marketing missteps I think I've ever seen. I think it would have actually received very good reviews, right?
Right.
I think it would have, you'd have had clear price differentiation against the 4070 and the 4070 Super. The performance regressions against 4070 Super would be an irrelevance, really, since they're relatively slight, and it would be $100 cheaper. $500 for a 12 gig GPU. Well, okay, it's not optimal, but it's okay. I think the package would have been just much better overall. So I'm wondering well, it's also less efficient than the 4070 Super in some regards. So, there are hardware issues there for sure. I just think maybe it's more of a pricing and marketing issue for the 5070. But yeah, Oliver, what do you think?
I don't really think that they're going to end their presence as a gaming company. If you look at gaming revenue over time, it's steady. It's just that their data center revenue has gone from 50% or so of their total revenue like 3 years ago to 90% now, roughly speaking, as this user puts it. Well, gaming revenue is flat, essentially. I do think their development and manufacturing priorities are probably oriented more around these AI chips, which have colossally high margins. But
yeah,
I think that'll continue to be the case in the future, but I don't think that that's the end of their gaming focus by any means. I just think that in terms of their overall priorities, it's probably shifted, at least for the time being, towards those AI chips. I don't think that means the end of their gaming line here, but I do think it marks a shift in priorities for the company.
Yeah, I think ultimately, a good business is a diversified business. You want to be dominant in several markets, not just one. And, basically there's an ebb and flow to these markets. And, the AI side of things might not always be commanding so much of the revenue. You've got to stay on top in all areas. I would be surprised to see, things change that badly. But at the same time, I take on board what Alex is saying. The 4060 wasn't great. 4060 Ti wasn't great. 5070, now we're seeing it creep into the 70 class products. The 5070, wasn't great. Yeah, it's a bit worrying. Anyway, final question. This one from Degenerative AI. Greetings, gents. Do you think we'll ever get to a point during this generation where you can build an equivalent or better PC for the same price as a console? You can already do this with used parts if you manage to get lucky with good deals, but it's only really valid if you ignore that used consoles or official/retailer refurbished with a warranty exist too. On the budget side, you can readily get chips that outperform the aging Zen 2 parts in consoles. Unfortunately, in the budget GPU tier, we still have upcoming cards, namely 5060 and 9060, expected to release with 8 gig VRAM models, significantly lower than PS5 Series X have access to, requiring settings compromises and having questionable longevity. Will the VRAM skimping ever end? So we've got two questions there, really. They are obviously interconnected, of course. This concept of being able to buy an equivalent or better PC for the same price as a console, and the VRAM skimping. The VRAM skimping thing, I kind of think it may persist into this generation and possibly then move on from there. I mean, just from a competition side of things, Intel are coming in with 10 and 12 gig models at the budget side. Surely at some point we've got to move on from 8 gigs, Alex.
Yeah, 8 gigs is just such a big anchor around any sort of movement. Like, you've got this GPU which has like shading power, it's got machine learning, it has the ability to do frame gen, it can potentially do all these great things, but it's limited to please only play at 1080p for the love of God. Like, that's like all it says. And then it's like every single time a game comes out that is problematic, and there's more and more of them each time, because I'm sorry, a lot of devs really are not putting a good focus on this when they should at times, but also 8 gigs, like, that is a limiting factor when you have more on console to work with for texture memory specifically. And, there's only so much you can expect of developers in scaling, and you should expect more eventually at some point from your GPU. Apparently Nvidia did at some point too with the 3060 12 gig. Like, they apparently also thought it was worth it at some point, and then they're like, nah, so yeah, I'm not happy about it. I would not at all buy an 8 gigabyte GPU. I would flat out disrecommend every single person playing AAA games to buy a new 8 gigabyte GPU. Like, if it comes out, I'm just going to flat out know it. So yeah. I don't think with the first part of the question here is going to be a realistic possibility in the current future for new products coming out. The used one was already mentioned, but for new products, the console buyers now, they have access to, since they're buying in bulk and buying direct, they have a completely different pricing scheme, and they're manufacturing so many more units. And they're part of the design process. It's not at all going to be any point in the near future where you get a $499 complete PC that is going to be rivaling the GPU experience you get there on the console side, I don't think. And I think that is really unfortunate. It's definitely a newer thing that happened this time around. But Rich has talked about it a bunch of times before. The manufacturing situation is completely different now.
Just my thoughts on this quickly. The thing about the consoles, of course, is that there's the total cost of ownership, which essentially requires a significant subscription. So obviously the situation changed somewhat with the PS5 Pro. Being a $700 console, even more expensive in Europe, of course. There's a lot of sort of variables to take into account when building an equivalent or better PC. But that equivalent or better PC really does need a GPU with at least 12 gigs of memory. That's the kind of issue that you've got there. So we kind of need those 12 gig GPUs to come down. We've got a 5060 Ti coming, which will have 16 gigs, but I'm really worried that they're going to do what they did with 4060 Ti and slap on $100 price premium on that, which would just be nuts. I really hope they do something about that. 5060 being 8 gigs, it's not great, is it? But AMD seem to be doing the same thing with an 8/16 gig differential on 9060 and 9060 XT, if the rumors are to be believed. I can kind of see why this is happening because, both of the vendors there are going to be having phone home data that's basically saying, well, if these guys are just playing Rainbow Six or Fortnite or whatever on their 60 class products, might as well ship with 8 gigs of memory. But then you get the concept of people wanting to buy, new games, not just the live service stuff, which has to run across a broad range of hardware, and they're going to come up short. Mm-hmm. And that's just not great. Do you have any input on this, Oliver?
Yeah, I just think the efficiencies of producing one specially constructed box with few middlemen, with no extra PCIe or SATA or a box that's inefficiently designed and maybe made of a premium construction material like aluminum, or all these efficiencies with no spare cent spent, as I put it. It should mean that if console makers are doing their job, then building an equivalent PC with new parts for a similar price shouldn't really be possible. The only exception I would think is like in some world where there's some crazy performance enhancing feature on PC that isn't available on consoles. Maybe it's more achievable in that world. And the VRAM question, I don't think it will end this generation, but maybe those non-binary RAM configurations that you could fit, like, say, 12 gigabytes on a 128-bit bus. That's kind of the particular pain point at the moment with those lower tier cards. Maybe that'll be something that's more common next generation, but it doesn't really seem to be something that we're going to see a whole lot of this generation, at least not immediately. So that's maybe in the future it will be ameliorated to some degree by that fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that 3060 situation was kind of interesting, wasn't it, Alex? I think it was a $330 product. It had a 192-bit memory interface, so they kind of had to ship with either 6 or 12 gigs, and 6 gigs was becoming untenable at that point, I would say. So they shipped with 12, but then ultimately what they did was to cut back and produce an 8 gig version of the 3060, which, it's enough to make you want to run out into the street and attack people with hammers.
You feel like it's not only that, but it's like half the PCIe lanes too. Like I showed it off in Senua's Sacrifice, right?
Right, yeah, the PCIe situation isn't great either.
It stutters more than a 2070 Super, which it is fundamentally more powerful in every other aspect. Like, why is my newer GPU stuttering more than an older one? It would also stutter more than a 2060 Super, for example. So like, I just feel like they're just taking so many little bits out of these GPUs, like the reduced bus, the reduced RAM speed, the reduced amount of RAM, reduced lanes, and it's like, it is this little tiny card with a really big cooler still, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't like that product at all. 3060, on the other hand, I laughed at it originally. I was like, huh. But now I prefer it actually quite a bit more to the 4060. It is a lot better GPU.
Yeah, I mean, less performant on compute, but the memory side of things makes up for things quite significantly, doesn't it?
Yeah, like if you're playing Spider-Man, would you really rather have it stuttering all the time and worse textures, or just like 15 to 20% lower performance? Like, what would you rather have? And I think with a VRR monitor, there's a very easy answer to that question. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing, of course, is that the 4060 is going to be put into a lot of systems that have got PCIe 3.0 slots. So that's really not good.
Nope. It's untenable at that point, actually.
Okay. Bit of a downer to end, but there we are. That was the final question, therefore, the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notionally instant notifications for you, and a potential algorithmic boost for us. But please do consider the DF supporter program. Early access to DF Direct Weekly and a bunch of stuff, actually. The chance to help shape the show. Weekly updates from the team, a lot going on there. Amazing community too. So please do consider that. But that's all from us for this week. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and we'll see you next week.